So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to this second session of our new webinar series, which we call the Blue Justice webinar series. This is organized by AMUR under the coordination of one of our three research teams, focusing on these specific questions of responsibility, liability, and justice issues in ocean activities, in collaboration with our colleagues from Kiel Marine Science, Silvia Klepp and Konrad Ott, as well as with the support of the OMER Research Network, which is organized by CNRS. And we have a Blue Economy working group in that research network, which is starting also its activities. And one of the activities is this webinar series. And so we're very happy to host our colleague Dale Squires for this second session. We already had a presentation by Dale yesterday, focusing on the deep sea mineral allocation of royalty question. And Dale already hinted yesterday at some of the topics of today's presentation. Dale is an economist, a senior economist from NOAA Fisheries, has done some landmark research in the space of fisheries economics, but has also delved into this question of, you know, what do we do with these deep sea mineral resources, and how can we address the economic dimensions of the questions raised by their harvesting. And in connection to this, the presentation today will be on the question of defining ethical preferences for global collective action, so handling global public goods. Thanks a lot, Dale, for making the trip and making time for this presentation, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, everybody, so much. It's a wonderful opportunity to come here and meet you all, and also bounce these ideas off you. You're the first group, so you're guinea pig, as we say in the US. So this arose out of something very practical. Michael Lodge and I had to think about how to distribute deep seabed mining royalties. He gave me an email and said, come on down, it's a little quick project. I had some interns, and famous last words, I'm still working on it 4 or 5 years later. And as Olivier said, there'll be some overlap with what I said yesterday. So we were faced with the problem of how do we get ethical preferences? So usual disclaimer, nothing doesn't represent International Seabed Authority, its members, or NOAA Fisheries. So our setting is the international organizations and agreements. And the economists have looked at international agreements, how you put them together. What I actually found kind of surprising was they haven't really looked at, once you have the agreement together, then what happens? And it's probably not as exciting of a big question, but it's actually probably a more practical question, because once you actually have an international organization, it's got to function. And so I've worked closely with the Seabed Authority, and then I've worked very, very closely for decades with the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission. So we're going to focus on a particular type of international organization, voluntary, self-enforcing, treaty-based, and through which much global collective action occurs. So obviously the Regional Fishery Management Organizations, the Seabed Authority, International Whaling Commission, which is a little unique because they have supermajority voting, CBD, the EU, really, the World Health Organization. There's a number of others. We're going to exclude weighted voting international organizations because it changes the decision making. And you're going to see that a lot hinges here on the decision making for fairness. It's also relevant for actually unilateral action. I read a lot of what the economists have written on ethical preferences for climate action. And you get in there, they're concerned with the social discount rate and a little bit with distribution. They'll do some kind of standard little mirrorless distribution weights, which again, as you saw from yesterday, requires a value of elasticity of the social marginal utility of income, or ETA. And what I found was that they largely overlooked the institutional setting through which much global collective action actually occurs, international organizations. It's sort of like it just happens. But because I work with the regional fishery management organizations and the seabed authority, I'm thinking about how it works from inside. And I'm often a member of the US delegation to some of these organizations. So the questions are, we need ethical preferences for relative inequality aversion, that is progressivity, when we're designing policies, addressing distributive impacts, and overall looking at social welfare and fairness and equitable allocations. Now the question is, whose ethical preferences? Individuals or the states parties to the international organizations? Well, if you were here yesterday, you know the answer. But now economics largely looks at individuals, not very much on states parties. And now, so anyway, whose preferences? It's either going to be individuals or it's going to be the states parties. And then what should be measured? How do you get ethical preferences? And then once you decide what to measure, how do you quantify it? So to jump ahead, whose answers? States parties, not individuals. And international humanitarian law is an exception. Here, we're looking at ethical preferences of the United Nations General Assembly, arguably the most legitimate global social planner. And we're going to use it, as you saw from yesterday, for fair, equitable, and Pareto-efficient distribution of royalties. And then the approach is applicable for many other international organizations. Richard Carson and I at UCSD, I've downloaded a lot of this. We're slowly building up the database, and then we'll estimate this to compare across international organizations. I'm doing this for the Convention on Biological Diversity to estimate a social discount rate. And I'm going to also do the same thing with the tuna RFMOs. I've done it for the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, so I think I did it wrong. So I got to go back to it. So the question is, so again on the answers, what and how to measure for ethical preferences for progressivity, relative inequality aversion. Here we're going to measure the elasticity of the social marginal utility of income. It's a measure of relative inequality aversion, or maybe a bit more loosely, progressivity and distribution. When you look at the literature in economics, it's mostly in climate change. There's no consensus. It's all over the map. And most are based either on subjective evaluations or national studies. There's no estimate of ETA, the elasticity of the social marginal utility of income, from either revealed or stated preferences in international organizations, consistent with the legal framework, the norms and precedent of an organization, and international law. Precedent really counts. So when we were looking at this for the International Seabed Authority, so we basically said, who's going to argue with you? It's a UN agency. Who's going to argue with the UN General Assembly? Nobody. Remember, you got to convince people. You're up there selling them. And precedent's really important in these areas. Yesterday, and you'll see some here, I dropped a lot of names from historical literature, partly to be a good scholar, but also to establish precedent, which gives you legitimacy. So what is ETA and how do we use it? So the intuitive answer, it measures the degree of progressivity and distribution of resource benefits and costs. It actually can have up to 3 uses. The standard use is how I'm using it. It's got a pretty wide range between 0 and infinity. The larger is ETA, the greater the progressivity or the aversion to inequality. When ETA is 0, it's utilitarianism. You don't care about the distribution. When ETA is infinity, you get Rawls' difference principle, or maximum, where you maximize the priority for the worst off in society. When ETA is equal to 1, which is what we found, that's kind of a medium range value. It corresponds to an additively logarithmic or Bernoulli-Nash social welfare function. And the estimates in the literature range between about 0.5 and 10, but they're mostly between about 1 and 2. Today I'm doing pure welfarism with utility, all right, welfare economics. The stuff yesterday had some, but you didn't really need it. Now the technical answer, ETA measures the percentage reduction in the marginal utility arising from a 1% increase in consumption, which is usually equated with income, for a representative party from a social welfare function. So basically you're looking at the social welfare function curvature. So how is it used? Social discount rates and the Ramsey rule. Social distribution rates, social distribution weights you saw me do yesterday. If you want to actually specify a social welfare function, the inequality adjusted human development index uses ETA equal to 1. Equity and poverty indices, some, not all use them, but many of them actually require a value for relative inequality aversion. The Atkinson measure, there's a couple poverty measures that require it. Climate change studies, Stern in his famous report used ETA equals 1. You know, there was lots and lots of controversy over that value. Cost benefit analysis uses this. So now the question is, whose preferences count? Individuals or states parties to the international organizations? And as I said, economics mostly specifies individuals, a representative individual, or occasionally states as the economic agent. And if they use states, they'll assume the governments are rational agents with standard purposes, representing citizens with the same preferences. So you're back to individuals, okay? There's nobody in the literature that has talked about how to go from individual preferences to government preferences in this area. Nobody's talked about it. There's a couple ways. If you're interested, I'll send you the paper. I've identified a few people sort of talk about it a couple ways, but there's nobody that actually has looked at this. Then international, now interestingly, international relations and political philosophy have thought a lot about this. So individuals can be citizens of states, all right, so the states counts. Rawls is a big kind of the latest name in this, all right, in his Law of Peoples. So here we're dealing with states parties to international organizations. And then the other approach is cosmopolitan individuals or citizens of the world. So you're be members of a world community, regardless of citizenship. The first guy to really, I mean, Socrates, Aristotle talked about it a bit. The first guy to really kind of define it pretty rigorous, make a big stand on it, was Diogenes the Cynic. Cicero, the Roman, talked about it. Immanuel Kant, or if you go back and read, I forget the name of what he wrote. And then more recently, Thomas Pogge, however you say it, and who's a famous philosopher in distributive justice. Scanlon is a guy named Caney, who's he's a British political philosopher. So anyway, there's a whole literature on this stuff. All right, now so the question is, who has legal standing and who has what the international lawyers call legal personality internationally, but in international organizations. So sovereign states are the primary subject of legal personality and standing in international law and international organizations, not individuals. And international humanitarian law, as I said, is kind of an exception because you're dealing with human rights. And so international organizations, prima facie, except states, is fully representing their citizens' preferences. So we go as an economist to talk about individual preferences, and actually probably nobody would question it, all right? But anyway, I got to thinking it's states, okay? So we're gonna take states. If we're gonna go with strict international law, we're gonna take states as they are. We're not gonna be concerned with how they distribute things, because international organizations don't care, all right? They can't, otherwise they couldn't function. So now there's what the philosophers call scope, and international relations people call scope of justice. And here we get into what's called international and global justice. So you have international justice. This is where the states, and we assume they represent their individual citizens' preferences. Global justice is cosmopolitan individuals. Now, we're actually going to look at a three-way classification. So we have a hybrid as well. Milanovic, who was he's a World Bank. He was kind of the big guy on income distribution. He has a book, and he distinguished three different concepts of international inequality, which corresponds to international and global justice, or a hybrid of both. Unweighted international inequality, so that's simply states. And so it's represented by a single observation per state, independent of population size, and it corresponds to this international justice. And then we have world inequality, by Milanovic's term, which is inequality among cosmopolitan individuals. So individuals, where we assume individuals are citizens of states. You're picking up most people, not everybody, of course. And we equally treat all cosmopolitans as, if you were to do this, your cosmopolitans would each be an individual observation, and you'd have to get representative sampling. So if we're trying to get ethical preferences, assuming that cosmopolitan individuals had legal personality, we'd have to do a worldwide survey, ideally, right? And it'd be expensive. Now, there's a few studies that have tried to do something along these lines. They're incomplete. They're heroically done. They publish well. But if you're a staff economist working for a government or international government, you don't do things like that. Nobody has the time, the money, and in any case, it's states parties that count. So, and this world inequality for cosmopolitan individuals would be what the political philosophers call global justice. And then there's a hybrid, which is population-weighted international inequality. And you'll see this is how we ended up yesterday, is this hybrid between international and global justice. It won't be on this case, but because we dealt with the cosmopolitan ownership, this is how we would have ended up with. So anyway, this looks at the inequality between states, but you take this single observation and you weight it by its population size. It's kind of getting somewhere in between. And it's a hybrid of states and cosmopolitan individuals, and a hybrid of international and global justice. And this is generally overlooked by philosophy and international relations, much less economics. There's two exceptions: Arsène, all right, plural grounding, and then Risa, who's at Harvard. He calls it populist internationalism. Arséne's the guy that really, that's why you got a Nobel Prize, right? Why I work for NOAA instead of Nobel Prize. He saw this, very presciently in the 90s. All right, so now the question is, how accurate is states party parity in international organizations? People are going to go, well, all right, how do you compare Russia, China, US, France with Tonga? Okay, well, in practice, we know, inconsistent with Mancur-Olson's exploitation hypothesis, larger and or wealthier states have disproportionate influence and power. Pogge said this. This is an international relations one, and she wrote her dissertation on it. It's very easy to read. She just followed Young's book I was telling you about and applied it to international relations. It's a very good read if you like international stuff. Cecilia Albin is her name. And I found it to be a very good book. And then impacts cooperation. And this actually has been studied a little bit. The guys looking at these international environmental agreement models, they don't look a whole lot at ethical preferences. Instead, they're looking at coalitions and so forth. Now, under international law and IO norms and precedent, states parties have formal juristical parity. Under law, they're all the same. One country, one vote. Now, when I watch ISA, they televise their proceedings. When I watch them, and I've been on either as a consultant or a delegate, U.S. delegate to the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission many times. And I know a lot of the people. By now I know the industry guys and the representatives, and I know the Secretariat very well. And they pretty much take countries as countries. All right. At least in the IETTC, I've watched Japan and US, I'm not sure how much extra influence they have over in Ecuador or Mexico. I haven't really seen it, right? Now, it's usually the countries that, my personal experience, is the countries that have big involvement that tend to speak up. And I'm not sure their influence is so much because of their size, it's because they speak up. Yeah, but that's not very scientific, all right? So now, most of these international organizations have unanimous voting or consensual decision-making. What I've seen in the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, once in a while, a country, they won't get agreement in 1 year. And then there's a lot of pressure put on that country. It comes around the following year. ISA, it's still too early for anything. And you can see right, if you follow it, the African countries, there's 54, 55 of them, they speak as a unified bloc. It's amazing to watch. Anyway, so jurisdictional parity, unanimous voting, international law, and IO norms and precedent give states parties ethical preferences, formal legitimacy and legality in decision making. There's behind the scenes stuff going on, of course. All right. Now, what about non-state actors? They don't count. All right. I don't know about humanitarian law, but in this world, DOSI doesn't care. Nobody cares. They're the last ones to talk. The NGOs at the very end. All right, what do you got to say? And they get up, say it, and everybody sits down. So IOs and more broadly international law do not recognize NGOs or non-state nations with legal personality or standing when they get into the international organizations. They recognize them as observers, and even then you have to have formal observer status. You can get it, but you don't just walk in and say, this is what I think. So in sum, it's usually only states parties have legal personality and standing in international organizations. All right, then economists make a distinction between stated and revealed preferences. So stated preferences are where you state them. And there's different ways of measuring them: conjoint analysis, contingent valuation studies. So economists have looked at this stuff. Stated preferences differ from those conventional for individuals. Now, unrevealed preferences, this is what individuals or states parties reveal by their actions. So a market price would be a revealed preference. And we're going to do something else. It's what you reveal by your actual behavior. Now, voting or consensual decision making in IOs, so it will automatically aggregate states' private information about their preferences, giving you a Pareto efficient allocation. The early social choice theory actually started out of the two French guys. Sorry for the name. Always a standing apology for accent. Condorcet. Yeah, and then who was the other guy that they had the big voting, big dispute between him and there was another contemporary, all right? And these are the guys that actually, they actually have done the definitive work on voting. And they were the first guys to really do social choice theory, all right, when you stretch it back. I forget the other guy's name, but they both are real famous in this area. Now, so here's the interesting thing about revealed preferences is focal points. So I found, when jumping ahead, I found ETA to be one. All right, so I emailed Nicholas Stern. All right, and I want to see what his reaction is. Right, somebody actually sort of vindicates him because he's attacked like crazy. And he came back and he said, well, revealed preferences. And we adopted his method, as you'll see. And he came back and he said, revealed preferences got a lot of problems, all right, in a very polite way. But what I've seen is they provide, well, you can use it directly, which is what we did. And he's, in some book, he pointed to what he wrote. And so you can directly use them like we did. Or here's the point. It gives you a focal point for states to develop their stated preferences. And it allows states to narrow the plausible outcomes, legitimate and coordinate negotiations to balance the settlement of different interests. And I've seen that, and it's really true. Otherwise, it's like popping popcorn without a lid. Right? It's everywhere, okay? But the stuff I was doing yesterday and on this, okay, you really define the boundary, the space, and you lock them in with logical arguments. I mean, so go argue with like you saw from yesterday, argue with Aristotle, argue with Condorcet, sorry, and on, so, and you'll notice I've done a lot of that. I'm a bureaucrat and I kind of go, go argue with this guy, with Aristotle, don't argue with me. So they really truly bound the decision making. When we gave this, I did something similar with the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission. And when you apply this sort of stuff, you take the bluster out. You take the posturing out. All right, they can't just say arbitrary things, subjective things. Now they have to argue with equity principles. Okay, those are tools. Equity principles are your friend. They are tools to be used. Okay. All right, now fairness. This is what I presented yesterday. So, Internet IO decision-making process for the kinds we are looking at. All right, we'll give you a fair bargain. So we follow Rawls. Justice is fairness. Aristotle talked about it. Others have talked about it. Rawls, of course, kind of reignited political moral philosophy on distributive justice. So now, all right, it's fairness. What's fairness? There's lots of definitions of fairness out there. Some done rigorously. So now, if you look at the decision making for international organizations, they voluntarily, consensually decide. Right? Nobody forces them. And they self-enforce the decision according to their own valuations and not by a third party. They might use a mediator, but the third party is not imposing anything. So that's called a fair bargain in the game theory literature and in this particular literature. And then, so fair bargains in turn give, this William Thompson, who's at Rochester, he kind of mathematically showed as impartiality. But they define impartiality as no differences among a certain type. You define a type, and then you get just. And then Brian Barry, he's got a book on this, Justice as Impartiality. He's a famous British philosopher. So he said it will make fairness what can be freely agreed on by equally well-placed parties. That's a fair bargain. That's impartiality. So, and then the economists like fairness is non-envy. This would hold in this case because it's a fair bargain. But we feel that impartiality is much more relevant for an international organization as opposed to non-envy. All right. All right. Now we're going to look at the United Nations revealed preference estimation for ETA. So we needed a value. All right. When I was using those little mirrorless distribution weights out of welfare economics, I needed a value for ETA, and which is a progressivity estimate. So then you think, oh, how do I get this? So, and whose? Well, the UN is, like I said, is the world's most legitimate egalitarian social planner for ethical preferences on progressivity. And ISA members are those that have ratified the law of the sea. Okay. So, and now, we're talking about the UN General Assembly setting above everybody. So all states that have ratified UNCLOS are states parties. And then I applied the same approach, like I told you, the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission. I think I estimated it wrong. And Richard Carson and I are doing this for multiple IOs. We've taken the UN stuff back to the 50s. We want to see how it changes, over time. And it does change. I found when I was looking at the UN stuff, the stuff from, and I'll show you data from later years, was actually more progressive than earlier years. So how do you estimate these UN revealed ethical preferences? Well, we take Nicholas Stern's work from 1977. What he did was he looked at the British income tax system and compared the marginal and the average tax rates. So the marginal tax rate is a lot positively larger than the average tax rates, what we would call progressive. And of course, it could be even regressive. And so so I went in and I looked at how the UN taxes its members, the annual contributions. And it's based on per capita gross national income. All right, sounds like an income tax to me. And then they have a floor and ceiling. They make some debt relief. They do some progressivity adjustments. So anyways, it sounds like an income tax to me. And so these preferences, of course, will follow from social, not individual decisions. So now you're gonna use the ETA's estimated using the equity principle of equal absolute sacrifice. It's been around since the time of Mills and Bentham. Peyton Young came in and sort of mathematically developed it and fleshed it out in a paper in AER and in Journal of Economic Theory. Now, the equal absolute sacrifice principle implies that in any given tax, what we call the UN assessment year, the tax is taken from each member represents the same sacrifice of utility. And so the tax's marginal utility burden should be equal for all members and a normative representation of utility. So, as I said, I'm very welfarist in today, all right? I actually don't like it. When you have to get up in front of a bunch of countries that are not economists, and, you got to convince them, all right? Yeah, if you we did this stuff on the back door, and so nobody paid much attention, right? But if you really want them to really buy in, it's got to be something they understand, all right? And this stuff is, hocus pocus as far as they're concerned. So anyway, we took the UN assessments as an annual income tax, and so as I said, the UN per capita member assessments in a given year are based on the member per capita gross national income with adjustments for progressivity. So like I said, we're going to compare the marginal and the average tax rates. And the more they diverge in a positive way, the greater the relative inequality aversion, or in simple language, the more progressive. So our empirical strategy, our data came from the annual UN scale of assessments, World Bank development indicators, and the UN population division. It's really simple data. We just took, now you can get per capita gross national income. When I was doing it, it wasn't available. So I got country overall GNI, and I got their populations and divided it. I put everything, because it's in dollars, I used the gross national product implicit price, the GDP implicit price deflator. And then I took the assessment. I just downloaded and copied it by hand. It took forever. And everything was in 2017 dollars. Now, so we mapped it out. This shows you the assessments per capita by year. So here you can, this is the amount per capita, all right, and state is in state by year. And so here I just, this is without fixed effects. I just asked data to basically give me a slope and an average. And the slope is the blue. You can see it was regressive. And then this is just the average. So you can see there's a little difference. And then let's see. And then you have some, you can see it started in about 2007, you started getting larger outliers. Okay, that I found that very interesting. And there is a ceiling. It's at 22%. That's the United States. And there's a minimum. And now here, this is where you look at UN annual member per capita assessments, assessment per capita with per capita gross national income. And so again, you can see there's a lot of dispersion here in the high income countries. And interestingly, down here there is small island developing states do a lot of, I don't know why they're assessed at higher levels, okay? And you've got this group here. And there's a couple other big outliers. Monaco's one, Japan's one. I don't remember. Anyway, there's a couple that are just very, very, you don't know how the hell they got that number. I mean, they were assessed. And what else? And so you can see there's at the higher income levels, you're going to have greater assessments. So all this indicates that you're going to have some econometric issues to deal with, which we did. So here's what I estimated. I started with a simple linear. Remember, all I want is the slope. I can calculate the average tax. So the slope is simply the tax regressed on income, and that's beta. That's just the first derivative. That's your slope. And so we have a cross-sectional fixed effect. I have a time period fixed effect, IID type, standard IID type error term. And so then I estimated, I did tests, I found, these were both significant, each were individually significant as a group, no surprise. And then I tested for serial correlation and heteroscedasticity, found it. So then I used Newey West estimation, which is a way of correcting for both at the same time. There's another way, Driscoll-Cray, I tried that. I got pretty much the same answer. And then now, in principle, the annual floor and ceiling gives you censored data. There's only 4 observations out of almost 4,000. So in principle, you'd want a Tobit regression, which accounts for the censoring. So I estimated Tobit. I got exactly the same numbers, okay? And in terms of eta off the significance test, even the value of beta, this slope parameter, it wasn't until you're about the 5th significant digit, which doesn't mean anything anyway, that I found a difference between the Tobit and the ordinary least squares. I went with the OLS because I had better options for correcting for heteroscedasticity and serial correlation. So it's a mean square error kind of question between bias, slight bias, or variance, okay? And so I went with the variance because the bias is so small. And I happen to like standard errors a lot, okay? So anyway, we all have our things we get interested in. So then we also did population weighted international inequality, where there's a standard algorithm for doing that. And again, I use Newey West estimation to correct for the heteroscedasticity and serial correlation. So now the formula are pretty simple. Eta is 1 minus the log of the marginal tax rate divided by 1 minus the log of the average tax rate. So what I did was I just programmed that. I put in the values, and then I computed standard errors. I did a linearized standard error delta method and checked for serial, whether it's statistically significant or not. And then you just calculate the average. And anyway, and you calculate. So this is beta. This is the average. Plug it into a formula, and then compute a linearized standard error on that. And then you get a hypothesis test. All right. And the value, I came up with 1, whether I did a Tobit regression or whether I did a ordinary least squares regression. And it was it was basically a standard, is equivalent to a t-test. All right. It's a really simple model. So, and I got the same result for eta equal to 1, whether it was population weighted or without population weights. Now, so that's a long constant average. What does it look like year by year? So I created a dummy variable for each year, and I estimated everything, and then I used that dummy variable to calculate, using the entire data set, a value for eta for each year. And so I plotted the average and marginal tax rates and the value of eta. Now, eta this is what you're interested in. Bounces around like a ping pong ball. All right. So what this long-term average value, you can see it masks or covers up considerable annual variation. Like I said, Richard Carson and I are going to pull this back to the very beginning of the United Nations, and I think we're going to see a trend of increased progressivity, and we're going to do it for different international organizations. And I'm in the process of doing this for the CBD to use the Ramsey rule to estimate a social discount rate. So conclusions, it equals, so Droop, Ben Groom, Maurice Droop, the German guy, Ben Groom, and I might have been one other. They surveyed 200 plus experts on the median mode mean values. And the experts came up with 1 for the median and mode values. That's kind of comforting. And it anchors a lower value for individuals with most alternative methods. So if you read the climate change literature, the values people use are between about 1 and 2, all right? And then it's consistent with Stern on that climate report. He got a lot of heat for using eta equal to 1. Lots and lots and lots of heat. Weitzman, some others went after him. Nordhaus, it's kind of harder to figure out what he did. I think he used eta equals to 1 on some, but I wasn't sure on all versions, all right? And I didn't want to spend the time to read through his reports. But and then it's used in the inequality adjusted human development index. So states versus cosmopolitan individual preferences, only states count, except humanitarian law. And we've shown a way to get revealed preferences. Like I said, we can use this eta equal 1 as a focal point, right, for discussions. Now, I can guarantee you won't, no one will change it when no one's even going to bring it up. I mean, come on, you get an IO, they don't even know what this stuff is, right? So you give them the value and they'll look at it and they'll send it off, like Canada on the report we did this in. They sent it off to their economists, all right, and they look through it and, add some points, but, basically they'll send it to some staff people, go, oh, all right, off you go. All right, but what it does, it coordinates, same with equity principles. I mean, in the end, this is an equity principle coming out of equal absolute sacrifice, okay? So it coordinates and legitimates focal group states' expectations and actions. And this is the part. You shift the discourse from claims to demands. I think it should be this. I think it should be that. All right. Now they got to justify it in a constructive, concrete way. Why? Which equity principle? All right. If you don't like equal absolute sacrifice, give me an alternative. Well, and then reasons to balance competing interests. Like I said from yesterday, that's really equity principles are great tools to incorporate. The question is, like what I've been dealing with is international on the scope of justice between international and global. How do you bring them together? And I did the population weighted approach here. All right, and I got the same answer, very comforting. And then yesterday I did a deontological approach for cosmopolitan individuals and how we wrote the rules. And then I took a consequentialist approach and looked how the distribution was for states. And then I kind of balanced the two. So how you bring these competing groups together, that's a bit of sausage. Okay, maybe that's even an area for trying to think how you actually bring principles together in a formal way. All right, that's beyond me, but that's something to think about. And our hands-on experience in international organs, Michael is the architect of the Western Central Pacific Treaty for tunas, him and Nandan, and then I was on a lot of US treaty negotiation teams for access agreements in the Western and Central Pacific. And I've sat through lots and lots of treaty negotiations. And then of course, just trying to get resolutions through international organizations. I've sat through lots of Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission. It's either a consultant or a US delegation member. And Michael, of course, he runs one of these things. And this is our experience that a focal point like this, I see it with stock assessments a lot, okay? And you guys have probably experienced that. But when you come up with one of these numbers and it's based on science or principles or something like that, it really provides a great focal point. And then they can start, moving it here and there a little bit. But they have to justify it. You keep the bargaining space pretty confined, and they have to do it on a good reason. And then the last thing I found interesting, this came on a back and forth with Stern, okay, when I was kind of emailing him. The world likes proportionality. So this is eta equals 1 is an additively logarithmic or Bernoulli-Nash social welfare function. So that's additively logarithmic. So that's proportionality for the global commons. And then it ranges, this is what Stern told me, it ranges from Islamic community zakat to the Christian society's tithes. If you go in, you'll read the Chinese equal field system, which is how they distributed land. All right, it's actually quite interesting. It's basically proportionality. Modern bankruptcy laws, if you read claims, I'm digging into the claims literature problem to look at the pre-entry issue in fisheries. Well, that's not different than a bankruptcy or inheritance, all right? You're taking something away from somebody and distributing it based on fairness. Many Montreal Protocol deliberately builds in proportionality. And many electoral systems are proportional voting. The world loves Aristotle's equity principle. That's it. So this is a short one, pretty confined. Very different than yesterday. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great presentation. Thanks a lot, Dale. We have some time for questions and feedback or comments. both in the room and online. I'm monitoring the chat here, so if anybody wants to jump in.